In this video, I'm going to show you how to use an EQ. I'm going to show you what an EQ is, an EQ's basic parameters, why we use EQing, the factors that influence your EQ decisions, and the 3 common situations in which I would use EQing. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to another music production tutorial. My name is Daniel and I am the founder of SOUNDSHOCK, a site dedicated to the modern music producer. If this is your first time here and you want to learn all things electronic music production related, when it comes to mixing, mastering, sound design, and arrangement, go ahead and click the subscribe button and the bell notification next to it so you don't miss when I release a new video. We have all heard of EQs before, and many of you have already used them before as they are the most common mixing tool. But what actually is an EQ? An equalizer is a set of filters that adjust the loudness of specific frequencies. So they are, in other words, frequency-specific volume knobs.
Again and again you turn to me. Again and again you turn to me. Again and again you turn to me.
If we were to start building our track and throw in drums, basses, pads, synths, and vocals with no EQing, then some of the elements would be hard to hear. Some would be too loud, and some would be conflicting with each other. In other words, the entire balance of the mix would be off, and adjusting the loudness of specific frequencies would be needed. So we use EQing to bring our tracks into perfect balance, so the listener can hear all the elements in your track with clarity. Now let's go over an EQ's parameters so you know how to control this tool. The first parameter is the frequency select or cutoff frequency. This is the point in the frequency spectrum at which a filter is applied and can select frequencies from 20 Hz to 20 kHz. The second parameter is the gain. The amount of boost or cut is determined by the gain setting of the equalizer. This is the volume knob for your specified frequency range. Next is the bandwidth or Q. The bandwidth or Q sets the width of the band of frequencies that will be boosted or reduced by the EQ. In other words, it affects the amount of frequencies around the center frequency that you have chosen with the frequency selector or cutoff filter, which will have a similar amount of boost or reduction. The width of the band is given in octaves. Here is a partial list of Q factors paired with their approximate width in octaves. So if our frequency selection was at 500 Hz with a Q of 0.7, then that means that 2 octaves worth of frequencies around 500 Hz would be affected by the gain boost or reduction. As you can see, higher Qs are much narrower and affect fewer frequencies than smaller Qs. High Qs are good to use for more surgical work, such as removing very specific problem frequencies, and lower Qs should be used for the rest of your EQing needs as they sound much more natural. The next parameter are the filters that you can choose for your equalizer. The first filter is the low cut or high pass filter. The high pass filter only lets the high frequencies through and attenuates frequencies after the frequency that you have selected. Next is the high cut or low pass filter. The low pass filter only lets the lower frequencies through and attenuates frequencies before the frequency that you have selected. Next is the low shelf filter. This filter is used to boost or cut the lows on your signal. Unlike the low pass filter, the low shelf filter does not attenuate the frequencies after a cutoff frequency. The frequency you set is the low shelf frequency. Everything below that will be boosted or attenuated depending on how you set the gain. Everything above the low shelf frequency will be unaffected. Next is the high shelf filter. This is used to boost or attenuate the high frequencies. It acts in the same way as the low shelf filter, but for the high end of the frequency spectrum. After that is the peak or bell filter. This boosts or reduces a specified frequency. The affected area can be widened or narrowed with the Q parameter. Finally, the bandpass filter. A bandpass filter is a combination of high pass and low pass filters, allowing the band frequencies between the low and high cutoff selections to pass. It's important to remember that EQing is an art form, and therefore what elements you EQ and how you EQ them is subjective. There are no hard and fast rules on what you should or shouldn't EQ. Many beginner producers always search for the perfect frequencies to boost and cut in every single one of their songs to try and make their mix sound fat. But there are no exact rules in which you can apply every single time. There are just guidelines. Every situation in which you will be using EQing will be its own unique situation. This will require you to find the best frequencies to cut, boost, or a combination of both that are specific to your individual track. So when someone says that you need to boost your lead at 10,000 kilohertz every single time to get a great sounding lead, they're wrong. There are so many factors to consider when deciding whether this EQing is right for your track. So let me break down the 4 factors in which I consider when EQing my sounds. The 4 factors are timbre, genre, the other elements in my track, and personal taste. The first factor that I consider when EQing is timbre. The timbre of a sound is its characteristics or tone quality. This is what distinguishes what a sound is, such as a voice,
wanna feel the sound,
instrument, or really any other sound. The timbre of each individual sound is unique, and no one sound will have the exact same character, no matter how small or big the perceived difference in character is. This is why each individual sound needs to have its own custom EQ. Referring back to the guy that says you need to boost your leads at 10,000 kilohertz. No one lead is going to sound exactly like the other. Its character will be unique, so treat it as such. The timbre of the lead sound from the synth or sample that you are using might be very bright and contain a lot of high frequencies already. And this boosting of the 10,000 kilohertz could make the sound too brittle. So boosting here would not be appropriate. The next factor that I consider is the other elements in my track. The other elements in your track and how they sound together also have an effect on how your track will be perceived and dictate what needs to be EQ'd. Again, going back to the guy that says you need to boost your leads at 10,000 kilohertz. Your track could contain very few to no high frequency elements, making the lead that you have in the track stand out a great deal in the mix. In this case, boosting the high frequencies of the lead might not make it brittle and harsh, but could throw off the balance of your mix. This could make the lead seem too bright because of the contrast of the other non-high frequency elements playing with it. So once again, boosting the high frequencies in your lead is not right here. The other side of this is clashing frequencies. Clashing frequencies happen when you have multiple instruments with similar timbres playing at the same time. For example, you could have a clash of high frequency content with instruments such as vocals,
So hold on to me.
leads, a synth. If you have too big of a buildup of frequencies in the same range, then the instruments will blend together and create a muddy and unclear mix.
So hold on to me. So hold on to me. Never let me go.
Back to the guy that says boosting 10,000 kilohertz on the lead is always a great choice. Since the vocal is what we want the listener to hear most at the front of the mix, we should just boost the high frequencies of the vocal to make it stand out, right? More often than not, the answer is no. If you just boost your vocal so you can hear it better in the mix, you might make it stand out above the other high frequency elements, but adding more high frequencies overall could throw off the balance of your mix and make the other frequency ranges, the mids and the lows, seem quiet. So boosting high frequencies in your lead when other high frequency elements are playing with the lead would most likely throw off the balance of the mix. So reducing the high frequencies of the other elements that are not your lead would be best here. If this method of dealing with clashing frequencies is a bit confusing, don't worry. I will go over it in greater detail later in the video. The third factor that I consider when EQing is the genre that I am producing. Certain genres might call for certain elements to be presented in specific ways. Some genres might have the lead sound be very reverberated, washed out, and lack those bright frequencies that other genres do. So while yes, boosting the lead could sound good, it might not be the best for the genre you are working in. And the last factor that I consider is personal taste. Of course, your own personal taste comes into play here as well. If it does not sound good to your ears, then don't do it. So maybe the boosting of the high frequencies in the lead might not be to your liking. The factors that I just mentioned are why EQing can be such a difficult task and why many beginning producers don't know how and what to EQ. Being aware of these factors will help you make the best EQing decisions for your track. So now let's go over 3 common situations in which I would use EQing and the different elements in your track that I would apply these to. As I had already mentioned, there are 4 factors to consider when deciding what and how to EQ. But from my experience, there are certain frequencies that I like to hear more of and less of in my tracks. Now, before I go over the 3 common situations in which I would use EQing, it will be important for you to consider the 4 factors that I have just mentioned and to listen to each sound that you EQ in the context of your mix, so you can make the most accurate EQing decision. In the 3 situations in which I will use EQing, I am just going to go over guidelines of what frequencies I like to cut and boost in my sounds, so you can get a better understanding of what frequencies I consider pleasant to the ear and what frequencies I consider to not sound very good to the ear. Again, this is subjective. So that brings us to situation number 1.
And now the first situation in which I'll use EQing is to cut away frequencies. This is also called subtractive EQing. Now the reason that I'm going over subtractive EQing first is that I feel it is the most important type of EQing. A lot of less experienced producers will often use additive EQing or boosting frequencies more often than they use subtractive EQing. Now for these examples, I'm going to be using the FabFilter Pro Q2, as it has a nice graphical display and will be easy to get across the points that I'm trying to make in this video. But really, any EQ could be used here. In the description of this tutorial video, I have added a link to the SOUNDSHOCK audio website where you can grab a bunch of free EQ plugins. So you don't need to spend any money to get a high quality EQ. Now I'm going to be going over different elements that have frequencies that I would remove. And I'm going to be removing these frequencies from these sounds when they're playing by themselves in solo. Again, you're going to want to be listening to these sounds in the context of your mix to make your final EQ decision. Just because a sound is clean and clear played by itself does not mean that it will be so in the context of your mix with other elements playing. The reason that I am playing these elements and EQing them in solo to give you guys an insight into what frequencies I think should be removed here. So the first element is a bass. Let's have a listen to the bass. Now with basses, a lot of the 100 to 500 hertz range can get really muddy and take away from other elements in the mix. So I'm going to want to be removing frequencies in this area as I hear there's a little too much mud and it's poking out and causing the sound to be a little bit too tubby. Now to find the frequencies that I want to cut in the mix, I'm going to be using a technique called EQ sweeping. EQ sweeping is simply taking a peak filter, boosting this filter to around 7 decibels, and using the frequency select or cutoff control and find out the frequencies that I think need to be removed in the sound to make it sound a bit clearer. So let's go ahead and do this EQ sweeping. So around 257 hertz is where I hear a little bit too much mud in the sound, and I'm going to want to be removing these frequencies. Now it's time to adjust the gain and the Q. Let's go ahead and adjust the gain first to see how many decibels we want to reduce in the bass. So 6 decibels is a little bit too much here. The muddy frequencies are removed, but the bass loses a bit too much power here. So around 3 decibels is where I hear more of the mud being cleaned up while still retaining its power. So now let's adjust the Q to find out how many frequencies this really should affect around our cutoff or frequency selection. Now this is a bit too narrow. We can hear the muddy frequencies coming back in. And EQ around 0.3 is a little bit too broad, taking away too many frequencies. Around 1.1 Q is where I hear muddy frequencies being removed, and all the other frequencies that are giving the sound its power and timbre are left intact here. Now without the filter. Now with the filter. You can hear in the mid-range it is cleaned up. Not a huge drastic change, but this will definitely leave room for more elements in your mix to shine through. The next element that I want to go over for removing of frequencies is this bell lead sound. Let's have a listen. So you can hear in the high mid range to high frequency range, there are some ringing frequencies that we want to remove. So we're going to go ahead and do the same technique that we did in the bass to find the frequencies that we want to remove, and that is the EQ sweeping. So let's go ahead and do that. Now around 1,523 hertz is where we hear some more brittle frequencies. The ringing is a little bit more pronounced. So we're going to want to remove these frequencies. Let's go ahead and adjust the gain. Around -4 decibels of gain reduction is where I hear the ringing frequencies are lessened, but it is taking away too much power from the sound. So what we'll want to do is to take a more surgical approach to this sound. Really only very specific frequencies are causing this sound to have a ringing and harsh timbre. So having a higher Q here to narrow in on the specific ringing frequencies is best. So let's adjust the Q. So a Q of around 17 is where I hear the ringing lessen and the power of the lead bell sound still come through. So without the filter. Now with. Definitely improved here, but I can still hear a little bit of ringing. So we're gonna wanna do another EQ cut. So let's find the frequency that's ringing out. Around 2,213 hertz is where I hear some more ringing frequencies. So let's repeat the process of adjusting the gain and Q. So around 3.3 decibels of gain reduction is where I hear the ringing lessened, but still the power is being taken away because we have this broad Q. So let's raise the Q. A Q of around 16.7, so very narrow Q is where I can hear the power of the synth still come through and the ringing frequencies lessened. Now without both filters, with both, much improved. The third sound that I feel usually needs EQing is a synth. So let's have a listen to our synth here. To my ears, there appears to be a little bit too much of the high and high mid-range frequencies. So let's go ahead and do our same technique of EQ sweeping and remove these frequencies to make the sound more balanced. Around 467 Hertz is where I hear a lot of mud. Let's adjust the gain. Around negative 3.38 decibels of gain reduction. So I hear the mud being taken out. Let's adjust the Q. And around a 1.1 Q is what sounds most natural for this sound. I can also hear some more brittle frequencies in the high end, so let's find those with EQ sweeping and remove them. Around 4,928 Hertz is where I hear these brittle frequencies. Again, let's adjust the gain and Q. Around 3.1 decibels of gain reduction. Sounds good here. Adjusting the Q. A 0.9 Q here grabs all the brittle frequencies that we want to remove. Now without the filters, now with the filters, to my ears, this synth is a lot more balanced. And all the other elements that you have playing along with this synth will be able to fit in and come through in the mix clearer. The synth is now not as bright as it was before, but there definitely was an imbalance in the high frequencies. And this imbalance will throw off your mix. So it's not always about having the brightest sounds in your mix, it's about having a balance. So don't get fooled by having all these bright boosted frequencies. It's about finding that balance. And the second situation in which I would use EQing is to boost frequencies. Certain elements respond well to boosted frequencies and usually have specific frequencies boosted in their sounds. So let's go over those. The first one is a vocal. Let's have a listen.
Twisted, bound into rope. In a situation I can't cope.
So you can hear the high end of the vocal sounds a little dull. And vocals usually are going to be sitting on top of our mix and will occupy a lot of the high frequencies in our mix. So we want these frequencies to be present. So we will be using the same technique to find the frequencies that we want to boost that we did in our cutting of frequencies, and that is the EQ sweeping. And once again, the vocal takes up a lot of the high frequencies in our mix. So we want to bring a lot of those out. So we're going to be using a high shelf filter here, as we want to grab a lot of frequencies and boost them. So let's do the sweeping.
Twisted, bound into rope. In a situation I can't cope. Twisted, bound into rope. In a situation I can't cope.
So around 500 Hertz, we're getting a little too many frequencies here boosted. And more of the mid-range is being boosted. And this will throw off the balance of the sound. We just want the high frequencies to be boosted here, so that will sound more balanced and clear.
Twisted, bound into rope, in a situation I can't cope.
Around 6,500 kilohertz. It's not quite getting all the frequencies that we want here. There could be more high-end frequencies boosted to make it a little more full sounding.
Twisted, bound into rope, in a situation I can't cope. Twisted, bound into rope.
And around 1,832 hertz. Sounds pretty pleasing to the ear here and gets all the frequencies that we want to. So now let's adjust the gain and the Q.
Twisted, bound into rope, in a situation I can't cope. Twisted, bound into rope, in a situation
8 decibels is a little too brittle there. High frequencies are a little bit too crisp. So let's reel that back.
Twisted, bound into rope, in a situation I can't cope.
4 decibels sounds nice and present there without being too brittle. And the Q, which adjusts how steep this shelf is, we'll want it fairly gradual here. So we want it to be a very musical EQ, not very drastic and sharp.
Twisted, bound into rope, in a situation I can't cope.
So around 0.4 of a Q for this high shelf works well and sounds very gradual. Without the filter,
Twisted, bound into rope, in a situation I can't cope.
with
Twisted, bound into rope, in a situation I can't cope.
the vocal is now crisp, clean, and a lot more present with this high shelf filter. The next element that we're going to be going over is our synth lead here. Let's have a listen. The synth sounds a little dull here. A little more excitement in the high to high mid frequencies could be added to give a more full and impactful and emotional sound. So let's go ahead and do our EQ sweeping once again to find the frequencies that we want to boost. So around 1,739 hertz sounds like a good range to my ears to boost here without introducing any mud. So let's adjust the Q and the gain. Around 4 decibels of gain boost sounds good here. And the Q. A little bit too narrow there. With this type of sound, we'll want a smaller Q to make it more gradual. So around 0.7 works well here. And also I can hear some more high-end frequencies could be boosted here. So let's add another bell or peak filter. Do some EQ sweeping and find out what frequencies to boost. Around 6,730 kilohertz is what sounds very pleasing to my ear and would be nice frequencies to boost. Again, adjusting the gain and Q. So around 3.7 decibels of gain boost and a Q of 1.1 sounds very musical, gives the lead a nice lift, and will help deliver the emotional intent a bit better of this lead synth. Again, I can't stress this enough. You guys want to be doing this EQing in the context of your mix. Just because the lead synth sounds good here boosted does not mean that it'll sound good with the other elements playing around it. So making adjustments in the context of your other sounds is crucial here. Again, I just wanted to give you guys an insight into what I'm hearing, what specific frequencies sound good and bad to my ears, so you guys can make better decisions with your EQing. But again, the 4 factors that I discussed earlier in this video will need to be considered when EQing, as well as doing the EQing in the context of your mix. Now, the third situation in which we'll use EQing is to fit our elements together. Oftentimes in your tracks, you're going to be having multiple elements playing in the same frequency range. When these 2 elements have their power and weight in the same frequency range, you run the risk of having clashing frequencies in your mix. There is only so much room in your mix for certain elements with the same frequencies to play and be heard in a clear and present way. So EQing has to be done to fit these elements together. Let's have a listen to 2 elements that are clashing together. As you can hear, the vocal and the synths are clashing here, as the main frequencies that give the synths and the vocal their power are playing in the same range. EQing is going to need to be done here. But how do we decide which element to EQ and what frequencies to EQ? When EQing elements that have clashing frequencies, you'll first want to decide what element you want the listener to hear most of. In this case, we want the vocal to be heard up front and center, as the vocals are the most important part of the song, and we want the listener to be able to hear what the vocalist is singing. Once we know what main element we want to have the listener to hear, then we know that we want to remove frequencies from the other elements. In this case, the chords, the synth chords. Again, there are a lot of high frequencies playing already, so just raising the volume of the vocal or just boosting the high end of the vocal would create an unbalance, as the low and mid frequencies would become drowned out and be very separated from the high frequencies. So subtractive EQing is the way to go. So now we need to find out what frequencies we want to EQ from these synths to give more clarity to the vocal. And to do this, we're going to do EQ sweeping in our vocal. The point of this EQ sweeping is to find where the vocal gets its power from. That way we know what frequencies to remove from these synths. So let's go ahead and do that.
Wake with you till the light pours through the clouds. Rolling around under the covers, floorboards shake the ground. Wake with you.
Around 864 hertz is where a vocal gets a lot of its power. So in the mid range here, and I can also hear that its power is also coming from the high range. So let's go ahead and do some EQ sweeping to find the high frequencies that give most of its power to this vocal.
Wake with you till the light pours through the clouds. Rolling around under the covers, floorboards shake the ground. Wake with you till the light pours through the clouds.
So around 4,751 hertz is where I hear most of the power being taken away. And now let's go into our synths and we move these to frequency ranges to let the power of the vocal come through in the mix. Let's adjust the gain and the Q of the subtractive EQ filters while the vocal is playing to hear where we still retain the power of the synths, but let the vocals come through.
Wake with you till the light pours through the clouds. Rolling around under the covers, floorboards shake the ground. Wake with you till the light pours through the clouds.
So a gain of -3 decibels and a Q of 0.8 here for the first filter gives the vocal a lot more clarity while still retaining the power of the synth. And now the second filter. And a gain of -2 decibels and a Q of 0.9 also gives clarity to the vocal while still retaining the power of the synth. Without the filters, with the filters, much more clarity to the vocal, doesn't sound crowded in the high and mid frequencies now, and the listener will have a clear and better understanding of the vocal. Now, if this situation at number 3 was still a little bit confusing, I do have a completely new tutorial video where I go over this topic even more in depth. And the tutorial is how to EQ a money mix. In the tutorial, I go over this process more in detail, and I even give you tips for solving money mixes before you even get into your EQ. So you'll definitely want to check this out to further improve your EQ skills. And again, EQing is not going to be done in one try. The addition and subtraction of different elements and the mixing of these elements will shift the balance of your mix, which will require you to revisit some of the EQing you have done previously. Remember, every EQ boost and cut that you do will change a mix's balance, so make sure you are constantly listening to your sounds in the context of the entire song so you can maintain a balanced mix.
Thank you so much for watching the tutorial video. I know this one was a bit long, but EQing is a very deep topic, and I hope by watching this video, you are now confident to go into your DAW and start EQing your sounds. Also, if you haven't already, go ahead and go over to the SOUNDSHOCK audio website, as this is the #1 resource for music producers on the web right now. On the website, there are free downloads, including samples and loops, KONTAKT instruments, plugins, and presets. Also, there are tons of other tutorials that cover all aspects of the music production process, as well as my favorite section, the interview section, where I interview top professionals and ask them specific music production related questions. So after reading each interview, you will have at least one actionable tip that you can take into your DAW right after reading it. That's gonna do it for this video, everyone. If you wanna learn more music production tips and tricks when it comes to mixing, mastering, sound design, and arrangement, go ahead and click the subscribe button and the bell notification next to it so you don't miss when I release a new video. See you guys next time.